Okay, opening prayers, the altruistic motivation. All mother sentient beings, especially those enemies who hate me, obstructors who harm me, and those who create obstacles on my path to liberation and omniscience. May they experience happiness, be separated from suffering, and swiftly I will establish them in the state of unsurpassed, perfect, complete, and precious Buddhahood. All mother sentient beings, especially those enemies who hate me, obstructors who harm me, and those who create obstacles on my path to liberation and omniscience. May they experience happiness, be separated from suffering, and swiftly I will establish them in a state of unsurpassed, perfect, complete, and precious Buddhahood. Tibetan. Dagla dang war pe dra no par pe jeg. Darpa dang tam che kien pe bar du cho par pa tam che kitso pe. Manam ka dang nyam pe sem chen tam che dewa dang den. Dug nyao dang drel nur du la na me pa yang dag par zok pe chang chu rin po she to pa ja. Action Bodhicitta prayer. Thus, until I achieve enlightenment, I perform virtuous deeds with body, speech, and mind. Until death, I perform virtuous deeds with body, speech, and mind. From now until this time tomorrow, I perform virtuous deeds with body, speech, and mind. Teche du sang ma ge ki bar du lunya gi sam ge wala ko. Ma she bar du lunya gi sam ge wala ko. Du de ring ne sung te ni ma sanda sam gi bar du lunya gi sam ge wala ko. Long refuge prayer. We take refuge in the kind root and lineage lamas. We take refuge in the deities of the mandalas of the yidams. We take refuge in all the exalted Buddhas. We take refuge in the perfect Dharma. We take refuge in the excellent order of the Sangha. We take refuge in all the noble Dakas, Dakinis, and Dharma guardians, possessors of the eye of wisdom. We take refuge in the kind root and lineage lamas. We take refuge in the deities of the mandalas of the yidams. We take refuge in all the exalted Buddhas. We take refuge in the perfect Dharma. We take refuge in the excellent order of the Sanghas. We take refuge in all the noble Dakas, Dakinis, and Dharma guardians, possessors of the eye of wisdom. Tibetan. Drin chen sawa dangyu parche pe pel den lama dampa nam la kyab suchi yo. Yedam kil korgi la tsog nam la kyab suchi yo. Sangye chom den de nam la kyab suchi yo. Dampe cho nam la kyab suchi yo. Pag pegen Dunam la kyab suchi o. Pawo kandro chokyong sung me so yeshe kichen dang den panam la kyab suchi o. Taking the Bodhisattva vow. Until I attain the heart of enlightenment, I take refuge in all the Buddhas. I take refuge in the Dharma, and likewise in the assembly of the Bodhisattvas. As the previous Buddhas embraced the enlightened mind and progressed on the Bodhisattva's path, I too, for the benefit of all sentient beings, give birth to bodhicitta and apply myself to accomplish the stages of the path. Until I attain the heart of enlightenment, I take refuge in all the Buddhas. I take refuge in the Dharma, and likewise in the assembly of the Bodhisattvas. As the previous Buddhas embraced the enlightened mind and progressed on the Bodhisattva's path, I too, for the benefit of all sentient beings, give birth to bodhicitta and apply myself to accomplish the stages of the path. Tibetan. Jangchub Nying Porchi Kivar, Sangye Namla Kyab Suchi, Chodang Janchub Senpai, Soglayang Deshin Kyab Suchi, Jitar Nyogi Desheki, Jangchub Tugni Kepadang, Jangchub Sempe La Pala, Dedag Rimshin Nepatar, Dejin Drola Pendondu, Jangchub Semi Kiegijin, Dejin Duni La Pala, Rimpajin Du La Parji. Short refuge prayer. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent, I take refuge until enlightenment is reached. By the merit of generosity and other good deeds, may I attain Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent, I take refuge until enlightenment is reached. By the merit of generosity and other good deeds, may I attain Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Chonam La Changchu Bardu Dagni Kapsuchi Dagi Jinsogi Pe Sonam Ki Drola Pinchir Sangye Truparsho. Four immeasurables. May all mother sentient beings, boundless as the sky, have happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be liberated from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the happiness that is free from sorrow. May they rest in equanimity, free from attachment and aversion. May all mother sentient beings, boundless as the sky, have happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be liberated from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the happiness that is free from sorrow. May they rest in equanimity, free from attachment and aversion. Tibetan. Manam kadang nyam pe sem chen tam che dewa dang dewe gyudang den parjur che. Dugnal gigu dang dral warjur che. Dugnal me pe dewa dang mi dral warjur che. Ne ring chak dang yi dang dral wei tang nom la nye parjur che. 100-syllable purification mantra of Vajrasattva. Om Vajrasattva Samaya, help to protect my vow, to purify myself. May you remain firm with me. Grant me the complete satisfaction. Grow with me. Be loving towards me. Grant me the attainments to master the powers beyond body and nature. Show me all the deeds of body, speech, and mind. Make my mind-heart good, virtuous, and auspicious. Revel in the bliss of the four joys, O Blessed One, who embodies the essence within me. Do not abandon me. Grant me the realizations of the indestructible nature. Make me one with you. Thus I signify unity with non-duality. Ah. Tibetan. Om Vajrasattva Samaya Manupalaya Vajrasattva Tenopa Tishtadrido Me Bhava Sutokayo Me Bhava Supmokayo Me Bhava Anuraktu Me Bhava Sarva Siddhi Me Prayacha Sarva Karma Suksa Me Sittan Shriya Kuru Om Ha 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 ho Bhagawan Sarva Tata Gata Basre Mame Munsa Basre Bhava Mahasamaya Sattvaha. 7-limb prayer.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I just got a message from Rebecca that she had an emergency with her dog she had to take care of right away. So, but she hasn't left. She'll be back. So I know I sent it out late this afternoon, but that was because I was working on it today. And that is, I sent an outline for the brief history of the Dharma Masters. So if you had a chance to see that and print that, oh, very good. Bonnie's terrific. All right, very good. So if you guys got it, it's in your email or it's in WhatsApp. And there was also a couple of maps in there that might be helpful to be able to understand this. So this is a study that I've been actually wanting to do for a long time for myself personally. And I keep a log of the different dates as I encounter the different dates of the different masters and different things that happen. And so I've been accumulating this date file. So that became the backbone, you know, for being able to say, well, okay, what's the chronology of all this? So, so this is the first time that I've talked about this. So if it's a little rough, please excuse me. But we'll dig in and we'll go along as we can. And if there's any questions you have, of course, speak right up. And if you have any thoughts about anything, any comments, don't hesitate to speak right up, and so we can discuss it. So I'll say this, that the major book that I use for this is my first go-to book for most things, is called the Encyclopedia of Eastern Philosophy and Religion. And it's a really great book. It comes from Zambala Publishers, and it is a reference book that brings together Buddhism, Taoism, Zen, and Hinduism. So in many of these listings that are in the book, which of course is alphabetical, they will have references that would be from the different traditions, from the Hindu tradition or the Zen tradition, all under, you know, what be that one word, what does it mean in these different traditions and so on. So it's really, really good in that respect. And also, if there's a word that is being used in the description is listed somewhere else in the book, it's got a notation there that guides you to go to that where there's more detail about that particular listing. So if you are interested in being a student of the Eastern philosophy and religion, this book is a great go-to book. Doesn't go into a whole lot of detail, but enough to whet your appetite. And if you want to dig further, there's other books that you can go to. But in many cases, it's thorough enough that at least it can give you a mindfulness of something that you might have read later on from another book. It gives you pointers to, you know, connect with those synapses that are been lost in your brain somewhere, you know. So it's very good for that. So I've had this book for a long time. It's very good. Okay, so we begin with Buddha Shakyamuni. And Buddha Shakyamuni, of course, was born in northern India, what was considered North India at the time, in the village of Lumbini, which is now in Nepal. That area of northern India is now called Nepal. So he was born about 566 before the Common Era. So before the year 0, when it became the new calendar, it was 566 years. So quite a long time. So it's approximately 2,600 years ago from now. So some of the oldest teachings here. So when he was 29 years old is when he became an ascetic. So if you remember the story when we went through the story of the Buddha and so on, and he was born and raised in the palace. His father was a king, and he was 29 when he left and went into the forest with the ascetics. And he was there for about 6 years or so. And when he was 35 years old is when he attained enlightenment, when he came out of the forest and he started taking nourishment again and gained his strength, and then sat under the tree of enlightenment, and he gained enlightenment in that nighttime. And then after that, he continued to teach for about 45 years or so, depending on which book you look at. But it was about 80 years old, 85 years old, 84 years old when he passed away, when he went into parinirvana. So I see Alexander's with us. Hi, Alex. How are you? Good to see you. So, so during that time, Buddha Shakyamuni, while he was teaching and so on, he, had his disciples. There were thousands and thousands of people that came to him, but he had a main group of lamas who were with him for a long time. I shouldn't say lamas, monastics, who were with him for his whole career as a teacher. And those, the three main disciples were Ananda, Shariputra, and Moggallana. I'm not pronouncing it properly, forgive me. But so each of those were, and if you read the sutras, that you will see that many of those sutras are question and answer between themselves, these disciples, and the Buddha. So they're like funneling all these questions to him, and then he's giving the responses to the multitudes that would have been present at these teachings and so on. But these were his three teachers. You can look them up and you'll find, a lot of information about them. So the teaching locations that he spent his time at, he was up in northern India, up in what now is India itself, and going up into Nepal. But he received enlightenment, or he attained enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, which is in India today. The city of Gaya is a huge city, many, many, many people, millions of people. And Bodh Gaya is like a little community outside of Gaya. So Bodh Gaya means enlightenment. So it's the enlightenment part of Gaya, this town there. And that's where he attained enlightenment at that point. So after he attained his enlightenment there in northern India, he then traveled to Varanasi, which was west of Gaya. And of course, he's walking. And so it was several weeks away in his walking from one place to another. And there he went to Sarnath, and that's where a deer park is, what's called Deer Park. And that's where he gave the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, which was the Four Noble Truths. So you've heard that story a number of times now. And then during the summer times, it would be the rainy season, would be the monsoons would come into northern India. Up in northern India, it's quite warm during the summertime, and but during the spring and the fall, very nice moderate temperatures. In the wintertime is a little cooler, and it rains a little bit during the wintertime. But the spring and the fall, it doesn't rain at all. So they get most of their rainfall during that summertime. And during that time, for many years, he would go to Shravasti. And Shravasti was this great place and had this great plain, this long flat plateau. And there was a king there who was very supportive, who was a benefactor to the Buddha, and they built this great big pavilion that that they could go to and have their teachings and so on. And when the rains would come, they weren't affected by the rains. So he spent 25 of his summers there in Shravasti. Other places he was traveling around, he had this kind of circuit that we go to, and so he was in other places. There was also there that he would go into deep meditations. And there's this one period where he goes for 3 months, he goes into this deep meditation where he goes into the Toshita heaven. It's the way the story goes. And he was there to teach his mother, who of course had passed away when he was first born. And many bodhisattvas were there in Toshita heaven, and he gave great teachings. And he came down from this Toshita heaven into Shravasti, and there's this great shrine that is there to recall this time. So also the Buddha would go to a place called Vulture Peak in Rajagira in India, and it's in the mountains. And there was this peak that comes like a triangular that overlooks this great valley and so on. And you can go up there today. You can go visit there. And there wasn't too many people. It wasn't too big. So he would have, a limited number of people to come there, but there would be many spiritual beings. There would be many bodhisattvas that would be present there. And this is where he would give teachings on the Mahayana Sutra. And he taught the Lotus Sutra here that came directly from Shakyamuni Buddha. So all this was happening in these very sacred places. So Vulture Peak was one of these places. And then he wound up going to Kusunagara, which is in northern India, just across from the border, right where Nepal is right now. And this is where he passed. He passed into parinirvana. So we say samsara and nirvana, samsara being the ocean of suffering, and nirvana being the liberation from that, but it is a temporary liberation, nirvana from samsara. So, you're still a human being when you're in nirvana, but you can hold that. You can become stable in nirvana. However, when you drop your body, when you pass, when your breathing stops, when your body stops working and your brain stops working and it releases your spiritual body, we say that you go into parinirvana. This is your parinirvana if you are able to be stable in that nirvana, if you're able to be stable in the true nature of the mind of the Buddha, that you go into this nirvana. So it was at this time that he knew he was sick. He had eaten some bad food, and he knew that it was time for him to go. He didn't have the strength to be able to fight off this bad food. And so he just let people know. He let his disciples that were all there, who were with him, and he's telling them, he said, well, this is my time. I'm going to go. And he becomes the reclining Buddha, it's called, where he's lying on his right side and his right hand is on his ear like this, and he's lying on his side. It's a very famous statue, a 28-foot statue that is in Kusunagara that you can go visit there. And he remained in that position until he passed. So they were all beseeching him. These many disciples are beseeching him, oh, Buddha, please don't go. Please don't go. Master, we need you to keep teaching us. And so when he says, no, it's my time to go. And here I will give you my last teaching. So his teaching here is this final exhortation where it says here in the outline, it says, behold, O disciples, now I exhort you, all compounded conditioned things have their nature of constant flux, and they are subject to change. Strive on ardently with mindfulness to complete your tasks. So basically what he's saying is that everything is compounded. We are compounded. He's reminding them of the teachings that he's given. and that they are in a state of flux, that everything is changing, that we're moving, you know, and that we have to be aware of that state of flux. And it says, and they're subject to change, but strive on ardently, be diligent, keep on moving with mindfulness to complete your tasks. And your tasks are your dharma tasks, to engage as bodhisattvas, to engage as arhats, to engage in being able to attain morality and to be good people and to do good things for each other and so on. So this was his final teaching that he gave to them. And then he had his last breath. As part of that was then put into what is called the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. That came a little bit later when his disciples were remembering his teachings and so on, and they put together these sutras were his teachings. So in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, it is said that, quote, it says, death is an opportunity to shed all that was bad, for all that can be good. So he was pointing out that, you know, that death is a natural progression, that we are getting rid of everything that is bad, and our body is symbolic of that, our defiled body, our defiled brain, that we're leaving that behind, and what's left is our pure nature, and to be able to maintain that, and to be able to sustain that in the bardo, in the afterlife, and then if we come back into another body, that we bring that into our next body, into our next lifetime, and so on. So this was expressed in that sutra. So he passed away in 543 before the Common Era is the year that it's said that he passed away. So after that, for several hundred years, for a couple of hundred years or so, his main disciples, Ananda and Shariputra and Moggallana, excuse me, Moggallana, you know, they became masters, and there were other masters too who were teaching and traveling and going to the different places that the Buddha had gone to and to continue the teachings. But then things started getting to a point where people were concerned that things were starting to get confused and forgotten. So what they did, they had a council. The first Buddha council was in 483 BC, or before the Common Era. And at this time, there was 500 monastics that were there. And what they would do is they would do the chanting, and the teachings. They would chant with each other, and they would teach with each other. So what they were doing was recollecting, recalling all of the things that they remembered. So it was kind of stabilizing this in all their minds in this first Buddhist council. And what they were formulating were the first scriptures, because at this time, everything was oral. Sanskrit was not a written language. It was taught in Sanskrit, but it wasn't written. They didn't have an alphabet for it. It didn't come till later. So they, of course, recognized that. And it was the Pali language that was first to be, the scriptures were written down in Pali. And then later on, then the Sanskrit was devised, and they started using Sanskrit to write it down. But the Pali is the authoritative original language that was written down. So first they were putting down the monastic code, which is called the Vinaya teachings. These are the Hinaya teachings. You know, the Hinaya, the vehicle. The Hinaya is the fundamental teachings of discipline. So this is what was first taught by the Buddha, because so many people needed to have discipline. They needed to learn morality. So this monastic code called the Vinaya was the first thing to be committed to writings from this time moving forward. And that, but there were also the metaphysical sermons that the Buddha was giving, and this was inscribed into the Abhidharma teachings, the Abhidharma books, and so on. So these are all the many lists and all the references and so on that the Buddha was making to all this inner Dharmakaya true nature that the Buddha was now the embodiment of, and he was teaching this to all the beings and so on, all his disciples, and they were memorizing this, and then they started to write this down as they agreed upon, well, this is what he said, this is what he meant, and so on like that. So this was the first Buddhist council that happened at that time. This was a little less than 100 years after the Buddha had passed, or let me see, maybe it was about 100 years after he passed that they did this. It was just a little bit after that Nalanda University was founded. Nalanda University was built in Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha first attained enlightenment, and had this beautiful building and everything. We don't know exactly what it looks like at this time. It's all gone now. The foundations are there, and if you go to Bodh Gaya, you can go and there's a museum. There's a British museum who came and they saved many of the things that they found, but most of it had been destroyed by the Muslims when the Muslims came through in 1,000 years or so after the Buddha passed. So this Nalanda University is where the best monastics would go to learn all the teachings and go through the different disciplines that were necessary to learn the Buddhist doctrine at that time. So Nalanda, there has been revived again, and there is a new Nalanda University that is a great place that the monastics still all aspire to go to, and the best students are able to go to Nalanda University. So it's been revived and so on, and now it is in Varanasi. So the Second Buddhist Council, a few hundred years later, or let me see, about another 100 years after the first council, they had a second council, and this was comprised of 700 delegates, because now Buddhism had been moving around, part of Asia, part of India, and so on. So they had delegates that would come from different monasteries, different places, to be able to come and be able to have this advisory council among themselves to decide on what was going to happen with the Buddhist tradition moving forward. So at this time, there was this split. There was this move to want to make things a little bit more liberal in the doctrine. There were those who wanted things to be very conservative and to be very strict. And so this was they were called the Theravadins, were the teachings of the elders, and the Mahasanghitas were the liberals at the time. There were some other subgroups. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that because I'm not a scholar. I don't know these things. It was just things that I could divine out of a book. I can't pronounce half of them. So, but if you're interested, you can learn about these things. And we touch on these things as we do other teachings and so on. And the Lamas talk a lot about these things as they talk about the teachings of the Buddha and the practices of the Buddha. So you can take advantage of those. But generally speaking, at this time during the Second Buddhist Council was this split in the Sangha. And some of it became very conservative, some of it became kind of liberal, new agey, if you will. And the new age stuff, you know, it kind of morphed into the Mahayana, into the ideas of the Bodhisattva and so on. The Buddha taught all those things, but it wasn't recognized by everyone because they had to have a high degree of transcendence to be able to recognize those teachings that he was giving at that level, at that Bodhisattva level. So, but most of the teachings were at that Vinaya level, at that Hinayana level, which were the very strict way of conducting their lives and practicing and teaching and so on. It was the concept of the Arhat was very strong. You know, that was the ideal, was to be an Arhat, to go and be a monastic, and then to be able to go and go into long retreats and be able to stay in these long retreats in caves or huts that they would construct, and that they would perfect themselves to the point of becoming enlightened through their renunciation. Remember, the first teaching of the Wheel of Dharma was the Four Noble Truths that included, you know, the cessation, and the cessation of the suffering was to cut yourself off from all these things. And they regarded that our life, our body was had all these defilements, and that it was through that, through our death, that was how we would become liberated to become enlightened. In other words, there wasn't a notion that you become liberated during your lifetime. It was that you had to die to do it. So the Arhats were those high lamas who, or the high, I should say monastics, not the lamas, but the high monastics who would go and they would practice this. And they became what was known as the hearers, or the Shravakas. You've heard us talk about the Shravakas. We see that in the prayers. So these are the Arhats whose enlightenment was a selfish enlightenment. It was for their benefit. They weren't thinking about the compassion for other beings. They would have compassion for their suffering, but it wasn't their motivation. Their motivation was their own suffering and for them to become enlightened. So these were the hearers. These were the Shravakas. And then also involved with them would be the solitary realizers, were those who did have, who were Arhats, who did accomplish a great deal of wisdom and skillful means from their practices. And they considered themselves to be Buddhas, but they were very selfish Buddhas. And they had no respect, or I shouldn't say that, but they didn't have any, they didn't honor their teachers, and they didn't honor the teachings that came before that brought them to this, but they kept themselves isolated, and they thought of themselves as being enlightened. They thought of themselves as being Buddhas, but they were not doing anything to help other beings. So these are the Pratyeka Buddhas. The Pratyeka Buddhas. So the Buddhas, of course, means the awakened ones, and Pratyeka means the selfish, means just for myself, individual Buddhas. So, so this was during this time, and they were trying to reconcile all this, and so those who were believing in those conservative ways said, okay, we're going to continue doing that. But there was this other group of Sangha members who wanted to go off and kind of do something a little bit more liberal and be able to explore the way of the Bodhisattva. They may not have had the complete teachings on that, but they wanted to develop those things and try and understand those things through the teachings that they did have and the practices that they had. So that was the Second Buddhist Council. So then, during that time, Emperor Ashoka came about. And his reign was from 304 to 237 before the Common Era. And he was this great, powerful king in India. And this was a very turbulent time when wars were being waged and he was absorbing kingdoms because he was an emperor. He was beyond the king, and he was absorbing these kingdoms. And he had this vast swath of India was his domain. And he had reached a point where he just saw all this suffering that he had caused, all people, you know, who have died and the terrible deaths that they died and so on. And he realized that this was not an honorable, wholesome thing to do. And maybe, you know, he had been influenced by some degree with some Buddhism at that time, because he then converted into Buddhism. And he decided that he was going to make his empire to become a Buddhist empire. So we're going to talk a little bit more about him a little bit later, but I just wanted to stay with the timeline so you could understand this timeline of what was happening. So here is that movement for Ashoka. But then later on, at the end of Ashoka, towards the end of Ashoka, comes the Third Buddhist Council. We see here at 247 BCE. And here 1,000 delegates come. So this Third Buddhist Council is about 80 years or so after the second one. And this was to reconcile the split of the Theravadins and the Mahasangritas, those that were the liberals. They wanted to bring the Sangha back together again. And maybe this was because of Ashoka. I don't know. But anyway, so what they wanted to do then was they wanted to codify what the Mahasangritas were doing, because they had their teachings. And remember, these were teachings that the Buddha gave, and it was only these few monastics who were remembering these things. And now it's many generations later. So everybody's trusting their memories and so on to be able to do this. And so they wanted to codify this because one monk may be saying one thing and the other monk saying something else, and they wanted to get it to be consistent. They realized that it was very important to do that. So they wanted to share these interpretations and be able to codify them, to bring them together. And also at this time, there was this movement of the spread of Buddhism up into China, and they were discussing what that was going to mean. They knew that this was important, and they wanted to be able to have some degree of understanding of it. I don't know if they wanted to control it very much, but they wanted to understand it more, and they wanted to make sure that the authoritative teachings were being presented as these migrations, as these expansions would occur, and so on. They wanted to maintain an authenticity to the Dharma. So this was discussed at the Third Buddhist Council.
Did these delegates, were they monks?
Yes.
All of them were, all through all the councils?
Yeah, at this point, everything would have been monks. That was how they did maintain a level of control. Not that it was a malevolent control or anything like that, but it was just to be able to preserve the teachings to be as authoritative as they could. So yes, it was monks. And they had nuns. They had females. They had nunneries and so on. As a matter of fact, his wife became a nun. The Buddha's wife became a nun. And many people in his family became nuns. So the female was really being developed. The female, practitioners, the monasteries and so on were being developed at that time. They were marginalized to a point that they weren't considered to be as fortunate as the males, but yet they were respected, of course, because they were the mothers. And so, and that they wanted them and they wanted to be reborn, to be reborn as men. So we've seen that in some of the sutras and some of the practices that we've already experienced, the Medicine Buddha in particular, where they talk about how the women want to be reborn as men because it's a better rebirth, as the way they viewed it at the time. Okay, so the third Buddhist Council gave way to the fourth Buddhist Council, and then that took us up to 100, the year 100 of the Common Era. So this is maybe I skipped over. I kind of combined those two things there. Forgive me. So there was like about 300 years in between that third Buddhist Council and the fourth Buddha Council. It was during the time of the fourth Buddha Council in the new era, the new Common Era, is when they were discussing the movement towards China and so on. Okay, so any questions or comments, anything? Thank you for bearing with me on this.
No, Lance, didn't a lot of the Buddhism spread into the stands, into the Pakistan?
I'm going to get to that.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to get to that. Okay.
Lance,
So now,
I have a question.
Yes.
On the first page, when you're saying that the Buddha was born as Siddhartha in 566 BCE, and then later in Kushinagara, at 543, can that date be correct?
That couldn't be correct, could it?
No, I don't think so. I was puzzled by it.
Yeah, no. I'd have to check those dates again. It might have been a typo. I might have typed in something wrong there. I'd have to look.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering if my mind just wasn't reading it correctly,
no.
figuring it.
He lived to be about 80 years old, so that wouldn't be possible. Here. Oh, I see what happened. All right, he was born. That should have been, instead of 566, that should have been 620. That should have been 620 BCE. So somehow or another, I got that date wrong. Okay, thank you for pointing that out, and I'll make that correction in the outline. Okay. So do those numbers add up to be better? Let me see. If he died in 643, 640, so even that's not quite right. So, they didn't have good calendars in those days.
There were probably some wrinkles in time occurring around then. So some
Yeah.
folding of time. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. Yes. Okay, so now talking about the further spread of Buddhism in the 5th century of the before the Common Era, it was all just around northern India. So if you look at this map, if you can look at this map that I gave you, you see in the center here in northern India is this kind of pink, dark pink color. And this is where the Buddhism was for quite a long time. And it hadn't spread too far from that during the time of the Buddha. And then immediately after the time of the Buddha, it didn't spread too far after that. But it was only as it got into the next century that it began to move south, it began to move north, and it began to move a little bit towards the east and so on. So this map might help to understand that a little bit. So during the 5th century, it was centered in that northern part of India. But then in the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era, so now it's several hundred years later, now we can see that it has gone all the way down to South India. It's gone into Ceylon. It's gone west up into Afghanistan. And that's when it went up into the Stanic nations, Turkestan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all those nations there, the Stanic nations. I saw a map one time, and all that was all called Buddhistan. They referred to that as Buddhistan. And you remember there were some incredible monuments like that. Yes, you have something? Did you find something?
You want to say something?
William, Bonnie?
Yeah, I was wondering, you don't have it specifically going into Tibet at any time?
It didn't go into Tibet until the 8th century of the Common Era. So it's not another 1,000 years before it went to Tibet.
So
we haven't gotten to that point yet.
Right, okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So it was moving west up, and then it continued up into Russia, what we consider to be, the eastern part of Russia now, into Siberia, and then came down into Mongolia, and then even came a little bit into the western parts of China. So all this took, many, many, many centuries, but that was the movement moving in that direction that's indicated on this map. So then, a little bit later, then it's going down, then it comes down. You see that from northern India, it's moving down into Southeast Asia. So it's moving down into what we would call Burma, what we would call Thailand, and Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and then going up into China, and from China into Korea and into Japan. So there was a movement going towards China from the north, coming down from Mongolia, but there was this other movement that was coming up through Southeast Asia that was coming up there too. So again, I'm not that kind of a scholar who knows all the details of all this. It's very interesting, but if you had time and you wanted to study that, I'm sure it would be very interesting. I know if I had time to study it, I would really enjoy that. But nevertheless, during the time that it was in Southeast Asia, they had these golden ages when the Buddhism was very, very prominent, very important, and the royalty, the aristocrats of those lands were Buddhists. So in Korea, it says that the golden age was between the 10th and the 14th centuries. And in Vietnam, the golden age was a little bit later, the 11th to the 15th century. And then in Japan, the golden age was in between those two times, the 12th and the 14th century. So this is just a means to be able to give us an idea of what was happening at that time. So, then a little bit later, Now, in the 7th century, or I should say a little bit earlier than that, because during these times, it was now it was during the time of what would be considered the Dark Ages in Europe, is when the golden age of Buddhism was happening in Southeast Asia. So if I'm interpreting this correctly, I think that's what they're saying. So, but in the 7th century now is when things started happening in Tibet. So Tibet was this very isolated region because of the Himalaya mountains. That was a border, was a separation between India and the Stanic nations on the western side, and on the eastern side were these great forests of western China, where it bordered up to Tibet, and so the plateau of Tibet is almost 3 miles high. So to be born there, you're being conditioned, your lungs, your blood, and the way in which your breathing goes and everything is conditioned by being born there. Those coming from the lowlands, from China or from anywhere else, coming up into Tibet would have a very difficult time, because it would take them a long time to be able to acclimate to that high altitude. And so the Tibetans were very fierce fighters, and anybody that would try and penetrate Tibet would be very easily fought off. So at that time, all those, so the years before, this 7th century, going back, many centuries and so on of Tibet, before the Buddhists came in, it was many kingdoms, many small kingdoms that were like fiefdoms, or they were very how do you say? They were full of conflict. There were wars that were going between all these kingdoms, and shifts would happen over generations, where this king would be strong and would be able to beat back, the neighbors, and be able to incorporate them into their kingdom and so on. So it was full of conflict. It was a very difficult place to live in Tibet. And, but there was this king who was in the center part of Tibet, where it's basically kind of flat, but it's isolated and protected. And this was King Songtsen Gampo, whose reign was in 618 to 650 in the Common Era. And he had an aspiration to want to unite Tibet with all these different kingdoms and so on, and everybody's fighting everybody else. And he had an aspiration to unite it. And a lot of the influence to do this came from his 2 wives. He had a wife that was given to him by one of the great leaders of China. I don't know if it was who the ruler was. I didn't write it down, but he was given this one wife, this one bride, and he was given a bride from Nepal, and both of those brides were Buddhists. So they became an influence on Songtsen Gampo to want to unite and to be able to bring in Buddhist teachers to start teaching the people what to do, how to practice Buddhism, what Buddhism represented and how to practice it. So the people at that time were quite wild, and they were, very disorganized. They had no language that could be written. So the dialects were very thick, and so one person from one area could really converse with another people of another area in Tibet. Things were very, very diverse, and and the kings, you know, they would hold on to their kingdoms as much as they could. There was a indigenous tradition, a religious tradition there that was shamanistic, and that was called the Bun, B-O with an umlaut over the O, N, Bun. And they were very fierce. They were, they had sacrifice, animal sacrifice, and they had a great iconography. They had the earth, you know, in the shamanistic traditions, the earth is revered as a living entity, and that we are part of that living entity, and we're the custodians, and we have to do things to make peace with the earth and these deities of the earth and so on. And they had this iconography that represented that and so on. So they were very powerful, and they had to be dealt with along with these wild people that were, you know, most of the population of Tibet at the time. So in my mind, I can imagine that maybe it was a lot like the American Indians. You know, they were, in some ways, maybe they were thought to be barbaric. In some ways, they might have been organized. Some ways they had love. You know, they had different degrees of things, but they were very disorganized. So that was one very significant thing about them. So this is what the king was trying to bring together in the midst of all this confusion and everything. So a little bit later now, a generation or two later now, comes King Trisong Dützen. He was born in 740 and died in 798 of the Common Era, and he became the king of central Tibet. And he now was born into this, you know, this movement to try and unite Tibet with Buddhism. So teachers were coming in. They were bringing teachers in from India, but they weren't, you know, they weren't real effective because there was a language barrier between the Indian teachers and, of course, the Tibetans and so on. And there wasn't a lot of written text. It was mostly of an oral transmission and so on. And there was a lot of mistrust of all this. And so it was very difficult to get stability with this. So finally, the king, Trisong Dützen, was able to influence the Shantara Rakshita, the teacher Shantara Rakshita. You can see his name on the bottom of page 2 here. And he was the abbot of Nalanda University. So he was, you know, like the president. He was like the main guy. And he was, so the king was able to influence Shantara Rakshita to come to Tibet to teach these Tibetan people and so on. So he came, but he was having a very difficult time. He wasn't doing very well. There were some people that he was able to influence. There were some people who was able to receive the teachings, because there were some people who were going down into India and learning the language and coming back, you know. So he was having some success, but not great success, and nowhere near what they wanted. So the king, you know, was saying to Shantara Rakshita, what are we going to do? So, so he said, we need somebody more powerful. We need somebody who can subdue these demons that are inhabiting all these wild beings and so on, who won't learn to be able to get them to at least in the beginning suppress these demons, so that we can make inroads in being able to change them into the Buddhism and so on. So Shantara Rakshita said, well, the only one I know that can really do that, the best who can do that, is the great Mahasiddha Padmasambhava. Padmasambhava was back in India, and there were these Mahasiddhas. The Mahasiddhas, Maha means great, and Siddha means accomplished, accomplished ones. So he said, and this was, Padmasambhava was the greatest of the Mahasiddhas of the time. And he had these great ceremonies, these rituals that he would do and so on. And that he, if anybody could tame these wild people, it would be Padmasambhava. So the king sent for Padmasambhava, and he didn't want to come. He was very, very reluctant, but I don't know exactly what was done to convince him. But nevertheless, he finally came towards Tibet in order to be able to help subdue these demons and these wild people and be able to bring the Buddhist doctrine into Tibet. He didn't know what to do in the beginning. So it said that what he did was, as he approached the Himalayas and he was in still in Nepal, he would go into caves. And then he would go from one cave to another, and then he would make his way onto the northern side of the Himalayas when he would get into Tibet now, and he would go into caves there. He wouldn't even come into Tibet itself. He was coming into these places, and he would do these ceremonies. He would do these rituals and so on. And these holy men from Tibet would come, and the aristocrats from Tibet, the kings from Tibet would come, and ordinary people would come to see Padmasambhava to try and understand, what was going on and so on. And through this, he was slowly able to subdue, these demons and these conflicts that were happening and these obscurations to wanting to have, this Buddha teachings come into Tibet. So this took quite a while. During this time, he was teaching, and he was giving. We're going to go into a little bit later, but he would be giving practices that his consort would be writing down, which became the Terma text, like the Bardo Todal and texts like that. So we're going to talk a little bit like that later. So this is how things came into Tibet. So we're going to, pick that story up a little bit later. So I just wanted to get this timeline of how we started in India, then how it moved south, then it moved in through Southeast Asia, how it moved up through the Slavonic nations, came in through Russia, came into China. And so how by the 7th century or so, and definitely by the 12th and 14th, 15th century, all that land in Asia had great Buddhist influence. Okay, so is this making some sense? Okay. Any questions? You want to take a break? Anybody need a break? Stretch your legs, get a drink of water or something?
Yes.
Okay, so now for the important people of Bonnie just disappeared, so I'll wait till she gets back.
Yeah, I'll get some water. Hi, everyone.
Okay, hi,
Alex.
Okay.
Very interesting history here.
And this outline is on our in the email that I sent out to everybody. So I hope things are okay with Rebecca. She says, I'm not sure if I'm going to make it bad. But
Lance, you said there was something wrong with her dog?
That's what I thought she said.
Oh.
Let me see here. It's in the chat. Lance, my dog just ate something toxic. I'll be back as quickly as I can, but I may need to go make the dog barf. Yeah. So. So then now she says with a more recent message, she said that she may not be back at all. So, okay, c'est dommage. She'll be able to see it on YouTube. Okay, Alec, let me know when you're back. You gotta wait for Michael too. Okay.
I need to make Alex Marsh.
I beg your pardon?
I have to make Alex Marsh.
I don't know what that is. I didn't understand what he said. So I tried to break this down to show the flow, and then I wanted to get into the characters, to the people. You know, that seemed to be the logic to me. But what do you think? Was that too confusing, or should I just done the chronology and included the people along with the lands?
You said that you created this outline from studying that you did?
Yeah.
That's quite an incredible endeavor. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. But it's not that incredible if I can do it.
I'm sure it took time and effort. I appreciate it.
Well, you know, it's for everybody's benefit. So it's good stuff. And it doesn't go away. So one day somebody's going to get my computer. Okay, so Alec, are you back now? Alexander?
I have a question, cultural question you may or may not be able to answer. I mean, a lot of folks in this part of the world were migratory.
Where, in Tibet or where?
I mean, a lot of folks in that part of the world were migratory people. They were, you know, what do they call them?
Nomads?
Nomadic, yeah.
Well, in Tibet, there were nomads, but in Southeast Asia and India and so on, and the Sanic nations, I don't think they were.
Uh-huh.
Maybe to a small degree where they had livestock and they would have to move them, you know, from one meadow to another to graze. But otherwise, that was it. The way that, you know, things were assimilated were through the trade routes.
Yeah.
You know, the merchants and so on that were moving through, and then the teachers, the monastics or whatever, you know, whether they were Buddhist or whomever, yeah, that wanted to move, you know, they would go along with the merchants because it offered protection from the bandits, because there were bandits everywhere.
Yeah.
But in Tibet, so if your point is Tibet, yes. And a lot of Tibet, in central Tibet, northern Tibet, and a lot of eastern Tibet, particularly where there's livestock was involved, they were nomads, yes. And they would have to take their herds of sheep and yaks and move them, you know, for grazing grounds at different times of the year.
Mm.
Yeah, the Tibetans, the Mongolians, very similar.
Yes,
as far as nomadic.
Correct, Mongolians too.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm back. I'm sorry, I had my hands wet. So
okay, no problem. Thank you for coming back. Okay, so now we'll pick up. So now we're going to talk about Emperor Ashoka, who reigned. You see here on page 3. He reigned during the time of 272 to 236 of the before the Common Era, approximately 250 years after the Buddha passed, was this great emperor. So if you remember the story in northern India, he was this great king who, and these lands were shifting, and he started, dominating and accumulating all these kingdoms and made an empire out of this. But he became appalled at himself for all the horrific death and maiming and so on that was the result of his creating his empire. And so he had to have been influenced at some point by the Buddhist tradition, and he converted to Buddhism. So he vowed to have a reign of Dharma instead of a reign of terror, a reign of Dharma. So he then started educating himself and learning about his people by going to the different holy sites and so on. And as he got to these holy sites and he would learn about what was happening in these different areas, what he did, now remember, this was 2,200 years ago or something like that, that they didn't have parchment paper. They weren't writing down things. And what he did, he would erect these pillars, these great pillars that appear to be made of like concrete or something. But in these pillars are etched the edicts that he would make, that were a code of living for the people, that were how to live a good moral life. They weren't Buddhist teachings, but they were like a little bit of a history with the edicts of what it is to be a moral person. So it says here that he erected these are called the Askoka pillars, and they're not specifically Buddhist teachings, but morality teachings for his subjects to enjoy a moral, happy life. And these were based on the Hinayana principles, the Hinayana principles being the morality teachings that the Buddha first taught. So when I was fortunate enough to go on pilgrimage to these holy places, not all of them, but many of them, and they would have these pillars in each one. And they were in different degrees of their integrity, of not having been sabotaged or destroyed in some way or another. But you can still see, the engravings that were done inside these pillars on the surface of them. So it was really an amazing thing that he did. And so it became a huge influence to his people. And there was this time of peace that was when northern India was basically a Buddhist territory. And there was love and kindness and so on. This was a time of great happiness in the land. During this time, he instituted vegetarian eating habits, and he forbade animal sacrifice because there was a lot of that was going on in the Hindu tradition, early Hindu tradition. There was sacrifice that was going on. And so he was, making it a sin to eat animals and to kill animals for the benefit of the rights, of spiritual rights and so on. And he idealized the idea of pacification, and he was strong enough to be able to maintain the peace. So, if there was tendencies for people to want to dominate, other people and so on, he had the strength, he had the army, whatever, to be able to keep that tamped down, to keep that violence tamped down. So it was a time of great pacification and happiness. It was during that time that the Buddhism was really flowing very freely and was being accepted very openly, all down through southern India and then into Ceylon. And then from Ceylon, then it would move over into Southeast Asia. So I imagine that there were some seaports there, and they had those great ships and so on that we've seen pictures of the people of that area at the time. So it was a great time to be a Buddhist. one thing that I didn't include here, it just occurred to me that is interesting, and that is that why did this fall? Well, how did it fall? It fell, this time of Buddhism fell at about the time, excuse me, about the time of Christianity started in the Fertile Crescent in the Mediterranean area. Why? What happened? The corruption came from the wealthy class. And the wealthy class was beating up on the Buddhists, saying to them, why are you staying here doing this? You could have my house. You could have a house like mine. You could have all these wonderful clothes. You could have all this family. You could have wonderful, consorts and so on. You could have, many, many things. Why are you doing this? And so the Brahmins, the rich class, the aristocrats of India were contaminating the minds of the Buddhists with these temptations. And slowly, more and more of them began picking up the ways of the Brahmins and leaving the Buddhism behind because of these temptations. So that by the time of Christianity, Buddhism in this part of the world had almost all gone away. And then when the Moors, when the Muslims came in a few centuries later, all that was left were all these buildings that were like empty and they were not being used because all the Buddhists had just assimilated now into the mercantile business community of being India or whatever. And so the Moors just came along and just destroyed everything that they could see, and I'm sure they killed a few people along the way, but basically they were destroying all these institutions, the physical institutions and so on. And then what happened after that was the forests just came in and reclaimed all this land and the ruins of all these buildings that were destroyed by the Moors. Then the forest came and reclaimed it all. And then it wasn't until the British came in the late 1600s, 1700s, when they came in and they're going and looking around and everything, and they're discovering all these ruins among the forest. And then they started beating the forest back and finding all these artifacts and all these ruins and so on. And they created these museums, for all this, because they recognized this as a great work of mankind. So the British wanted to preserve all this. So the Indians had let all that go to seed, so to speak, had let all the forests come in and reclaim all that. So that's an interesting part that I'm going to have to make sure I include in the next iteration of this. So it was always said in many of the books you read that it was the Moors that destroyed Buddhism. But I've been told and I've read that it was, as I said, it was the Brahmins that actually, the Indians that did it to themselves. And then the Moors just destroyed it. And we've seen that. We've seen it just in the not too distant past when the ISIS, the ISIS people would go into Afghanistan and Pakistan and those places that had great Buddhist shrines, and they would destroy them just because they could, just for the sake of it, because they had this brutal mentality to do something like that. So, that wasn't something new. This is something that, had been carried on for many, many generations. And I'm sure it's not localized to just the ISIS or the Muslim people. I'm sure that, man being the terrible man he is, has done this to other civilizations and cultures time immemorial.
No, Lance, didn't a lot of this survive in China? Didn't a lot of this the Buddhism thrive in China while a lot of this was going on?
Well, I'm sure, maybe so. And I'm not a student of that, so I really don't know any of the history about that. And I didn't plan on going into that. So maybe you can speak to that if you know more about that. Yeah.
Well, I know it was there, and I don't know the details. I'm not a scholar on it, but I know that when in the Chinese Cultural Revolution of the 60s, a lot of it that was there was destroyed.
Oh, is that right?
I
Where,
think
in China? In China? Is that what you were saying?
yeah, in the Cultural Revolution under Mao Zedong, that
Oh,
any type of religion, it wasn't just singled out of it. It was just a time of anarchy and rampant destruction, and anything religious and that was identified by Mao and his followers. I think it's an eruption that he fomented for the sake of consolidating his power. If there's anarchy, it's a good time to consolidate your power, and if you're loyal to a religion or anything else other than Mao, that's a threat. So it wasn't necessarily, as I understand it, and as I said, I'm not the expert, it wasn't necessarily anti-Buddhist, it was just anarchy, and anarchy with a purpose. And Buddhism got, a lot of the temples, I think, were destroyed, and just people were slaughtered.
well, that's in the recent past. That's true, but what about, 1,000 years ago? What was happening in the different dynasties of China at the time? What was, was the Buddhism at that time was exalted and was revered and so on. Yes. And that when Mao came in, the communists came in, that's what they destroyed, was the stuff that was created and preserved, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. Yes. I think maybe that, Tom, is that correct?
Yes, because a lot of that influence, the Chinese influence, what's 1,700 years ago went into Korea. They have monasteries in Korea that's over 1,300 years old. They're still standing today.
Yeah.
In
Japan too. Japan was heavily influenced by the Buddhist leaders of the the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. That's where Nichiren and Shinran Shonin rose up in Japan, but the Buddhism just rolled into Japan and was accepted as as the empire's religion pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Were the samurai Buddhist, or was that Shinto? What?
Shinto, yeah.
But that was Shinto.
Yeah, but it was pretty similar. Was
there a deity? Is there a deity in Shinto?
That I don't know.
Shinto is pretty much a lot of the honoring the past ancestors. A lot of that, and then I know because a lot of the samurais are a lot of Bushido. They live by the code of the Bushido, and that has a lot of believe it or not, that does have a lot of Buddhist influence in it, and it's
when I was a Nichiren Buddhist, a lot of the writings that we read, the scholars that were writing about the sutras were Chinese, and we studied Chinese Buddhism as background for the rise in Buddhism in Japan.
So all this really didn't happen until, the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries.
That it was beaten down, yeah.
Well, no, it was flourishing.
It was flourishing in the.
I'm thinking about the Buddhism, at that time.
Well, I know for sure Buddhism was flourishing in the 8th, the 9th, and 10th centuries in China. Yeah.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm. A lot of that influence went all into Korea, and and it stayed there. Yeah, they said their history and just in Buddhism is like 1,700 years. It's a long time.
Well, it'll be interesting to do a study on that. So.
I just pulled up a number that I had researched for a Sunday school class I was teaching last week. And Buddhists, as of 2017, were 6.9% of the world's religious people who identify as religious. By contrast, Jews, and I was teaching a Jewish teenagers class, is 0.2%. So it looks huge by comparison.
Right. I haven't looked at numbers in a while, but a few years ago, Islam was the fastest growing tradition in the world, and Buddhism was one of the fast growing traditions in the world. It hadn't stagnated or gone down; it was actually increasing. So I haven't looked at those kind of numbers in a while, but yeah, that's interesting that there's how many Buddhists, how many, all these different denominations, what is the world made up of, spiritually speaking, religiously speaking. How's your pet? How's your dog doing? Did it recover?
He's a puppy and he's an idiot, and he got a Sudafed. He's just about to turn 1, so he's perfectly a teenager. And he got a hold of a Sudafed tablet, and I looked it up online real quickly here, and it said that they were toxic and deadly to dogs.
Oh, really?
And so, yeah. So I just spent the last 45 minutes making my dog barf. It was glorious. You have no idea what you missed.
Wow.
It's my superpower.
All right. Well, I'm sorry you missed the beginning part of this, but it is.
Oh, I am too.
And you'll be able to get it on YouTube if you want to dig in.
Oh, wonderful. I'm so glad.
So it is there. And we're given this history a little bit. And all right. So in the time we have left, I just want to introduce Nagarjuna to you, because Nagarjuna is huge. Nagarjuna is considered to be by many the second Buddha, and he is considered to be the father of the Mahayana Buddha, of the Mahayana Buddhist, the tradition. And he was in India, and he founded what became the Madhyamaka school of Buddhism, which is the middle way teachings and so on. So it's through Nagarjuna that all the teachings that went up into Southeast Asia, went up into China, all came from Nagarjuna. So is the name Nagarjuna, is that recognizable in teachings that you've learned in the Korean and the Chinese and so on?
Oh, yes. The middle path.
Right.
The middle path. The non-extremes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he lived during the 2nd to 3rd century of the Common Era, so 200 AD or so. And he created the systemization and teaching on the Prajnaparamita Sutra. So a while ago, we were just looking at that, the Heart Sutra. We were looking at that and what that means. So, included in that is the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, the Heart Sutra, the Middle Way, the idealization of the Bodhisattva. Before that was the Arhat was the ideal, the lonely, selfish, practitioner who's going to attain enlightenment. But then now comes the middle way teachings, comes the Madhyamaka teachings, and comes the notion of the one who is doing this for the benefit of others. And that whatever I've derived from that is okay, but my motivation is to help others, to relieve them of their suffering, to help them to attain enlightenment for their self. So he was the proponent of that and introduced that. By this time, there was, written language. There was a lot that was being written and so on. It wasn't just totally an oral transmission. So his philosophical system was the first to be written down in the Buddhism. And he was talking about dualistic conception, that we are dualistic beings. So he was identifying this, and this is what the subject of his school was, and that we are mutually dependent on each other, and that the idea of emptiness, the idea of that we are all, compounded nature, and that our own, that we are empty of an inherent existence. So from that point of view, we only exist very temporarily if we, and that we don't exist at all as who we are. It's just an appearance of all these other compounded things, and we begin to recognize all these things. So he taught the two truth awareness, the two truth, the relative truth and the absolute truth. So all this is all put together as the Prajnaparamita teachings that Nagarjuna was responsible for. So he was vital in being able to now bring Buddhism to, where we recognize it today as we practice it, because the basis is the Hinayana, is the discipline. Then comes all this teaching of the dualistic conception and the two truths and so on. And that's the Mahayana. And then out of that, then comes the Vajrayana, which is the Tibetan Buddhism, which is the wisdom traditions of becoming the Buddha, of recognizing yourself as a Buddha, transforming yourself as the Buddha. We're already Buddha. It's removing all the obstacles. It's removing all the clutter, all the contamination and so on. So that's the Vajrayana. So it's the Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. So Nagarjuna was the strong teacher of the Mahayana. And it's interesting that the school is called the Madhyamaka. So those of us have any, Jewish tradition, the yarmulke, I think, is, I smile whenever I say that, the Madhyamaka. And I knew a few Madhyamakas in my time. So Nagarjuna, he taught something that was very interesting, because the idea of nirvana and samsara, and he taught that nirvana consists of not of something that can be attained, but rather in the realization of the true nature of phenomena in which manifoldness comes to rest. So nirvana consists of something not to be attained. We don't have to attain nirvana, but rather it comes in the realization of the true nature of phenomena, the true reality of phenomena, the two truths, the absolute truth and the relative truth, that the realization of the true nature of the phenomena, which is the multiplicity of things, the multiplicity of all this, all the appearances, all the multiplicity of this, in which all this multiplicity, all this manifoldness, all this, compounded nature and everything comes to rest. When all that comes to rest, what's left is the absolute nature. And that's what we are trying to recognize. That's what the Buddha nature is. So until we can make that manifoldness, that multiplicity, all that phenomenal nature rest, we keep on going to that. We keep on clinging to that, which disrupts our point of view of the absolute nature, the Buddha nature. So the essence of that teaching is extremely powerful. So this is the Mahayana teachings. This is the middle way teachings. So Nagarjuna is often referred to as the second Buddha because of this the importance that he brought to the awareness. So, you know, and that's one of the things about Buddhism, I think, that is so great. One of the things that I decided that it was worthwhile and valid to follow is because it is a evolutionary wisdom that is based on, you know, this commonality that is beyond our comprehension, but at the same time, for us to be able to recognize what that is, we include the contemporariness of things into our equation, that it's not all negated, that we have to go back to get to where we are. We can see that that absolute nature is viable and is working in today's society, and that what we need to do is to bring that in and be able to purify the stuff that's blocking it up and let more of that be part of what we're doing. So that's my interpretation of it. So that's where we are for tonight, I think. And we have more to talk about. Other masters, we're going to talk about the disciples that came after Nagarjuna and their contributions, and then we'll get into Buddhism in Tibet. So we've got the next 2 weeks to talk about those things.
Great teachings tonight. Wonderful teachings. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I know it's not very detailed and not very good, but we're skimming the surface and maybe giving some people some motivation to want to dig a little deeper and do some studies on these things. Okay, any other comments or questions?
Yes, great introduction. I just had one question. There was a time there was like a big university called Nalanda University, I think.
Yes,
so
we talked about that. You missed that in the beginning, but it's in the outline. What was your question about it?
So yeah, I mean, at some point it was destroyed, and so was that destruction coming like during the time of overall decline, or was it earlier?
Well, it was founded, Nalanda was founded at 427 BCE is when Nalanda was founded. Mm-hmm. And it was originally up in Varanasi. Oh, no, excuse me, Bodh Gaya in India. And then it continued for many, many years, but it wasn't until the decline of Buddhism in northern India that then it kind of went away. And then when the Muslims came in, they destroyed what was left, you know, of the building and so on like that. That's what the Muslims destroyed. Mm-hmm. But it had already been in decline. It wasn't being people weren't attending because the Buddhism had just fallen away because of the contamination by the Hindu or the Hindi Brahmin class. So
okay, makes sense. Thank you.
So then Nalanda was rebuilt at some time. I don't know exactly when. I haven't come to that yet, but it was rebuilt sometime in Varanasi, I believe, in modern time.
This Nagarjuna,
Nagarjuna.
that philosophy is the philosophy that we're dealing with today in Tibetan, this Tibetan Buddhist classes.
It's a huge part of Tibetan Buddhism.
Now, mindfulness was talked about earlier in one of these other situations here. Is mindfulness used a lot in the Tibetan Buddhism?
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely, throughout. Yeah, becoming aware, absolutely. Yeah. Exactly. Going back, if you look at the first page of the outline, and you look about 2/3 of the way down where it says the Buddha's final exhortation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it says, the last sentence in that section there, it says, strive on ardently with mindfulness to complete your tasks. So the Buddha was teaching mindfulness.
Okay. But it's not necessarily shown as being something that has been philosophized with Nagarjuna?
No, I mean, the word was employed, you know, because we're becoming mindful of our spirituality. We're becoming mindful of our physicality. We're becoming mindful of our intellectuality. You know, we need to be mindful beings. So it doesn't have a uniquely spiritual connotation to it.
What else are you hiding down there?
What do you mean? What are you talking about?
What else are you hiding down there? You got mindfulness and you got this and that.
Oh, well, we're not trying to hide anything. We're actually trying to bring it out, you know, but it does come in a progression. You know? The thing about Buddhism is it's not trying to make anything mysterious. It is trying to reveal the mysteries.
Yeah.
But there has to be an understanding of, you know, what it means, you know, so you got to learn to crawl before you can walk and walk before you can run and so on like that. You know? So
get the ducks in a row, so to speak.
So to speak, yes.
Yeah.
There's a vocabulary involved and thought process and so on. Michael, you had something to say?
Yeah, there's some considerate thinking and writing around the Buddha's Satipatthana Sutta, which is the sutra that he specifically talks about mindfulness, developing mindfulness, spreading mindfulness. Yeah, it's especially in the insight tradition, a lot of people study that sutra. There's a bunch of different translations from the Pali and from the Sanskrit, but yeah, I hear about it a lot. I've read a couple of pieces on the Satipatthana Sutta, where it's very explicit about mindfulness.
Yeah, you can get lots of books on mindfulness by itself. But mindfulness is also taught in all the traditions, whether, you know, Judeo-Christian tradition, Muslim tradition, Hindu tradition, all the traditions are talking about mindfulness. They might have slightly different words for it, but I've got something here I'm going to make you a copy of and send you about mindfulness. Okay, any other questions or comment? Well, I hope this is helpful. I'm enjoying it.
I like it.
All right. All right, so just to remind you, and Rebecca wasn't here and Alex wasn't here. My go-to book for these things is the Encyclopedia of Eastern Philosophy and Religion. It's published by Shambhala Publishers, and this book is there's many words that mean different things in different traditions. So there's one word that may have a meaning in Hinduism, have a meaning in Buddhism, have a meaning in Zen, or a meaning in Taoism. So in this book, it gives you all that under that one word. So it's a very good book. It cross-references all these things. So it's really my go-to book to look at these things and so on. So I recommend that to anybody who's interested. Okay, well then let's
Thank you.
Closing prayers. Thank you, Alex. Let's do our closing prayers, and then next week we'll continue on with our discussion. So our umze for this evening is Michael.
Dedication prayers, right?
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Page 18, 19, 20.
Mm-hmm. The lineage dedication prayer. Dorje Chang, Talopa, Naropa, Marpa, Milarepa, Dharma Lord Gampopa, Magmadrupa, and Lord Rinkumpa, please bestow upon us the most auspicious blessing of all the Kagyu Lamas. By this virtue may I achieve the all-knowing state, and may all who travel on the waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death cross the ocean of samsara by defeating all enemies, confusion, the cause of suffering. Bodhicitta, the excellent and precious mind, where it is unborn, may it arise. Where it is born, may it not decline, but ever increase, higher and higher. I pray that the Lama may have good health. I pray that the Lama may have long life. I pray that your Dharma activities spread far and wide. I pray that I might not be separated from you. As Manjushri, the warrior, realized the ultimate state, and as did Samantabhadra, I will follow in their path and fully dedicate all the merit for all sentient beings. By the blessing of the Buddha who attained the three kayas, by the blessing of the truth of the unchanging Dharma as such, by the blessing of the indivisible Sangha order, may the merit I share bear fruit. Dakorma prayer. By the virtues collected in the three times by myself and all beings in samsara and nirvana, and by the innate root of virtue, may I and all sentient beings quickly attain unsurpassed, perfect, complete, and precious enlightenment. May the teachings of the great Drinkumpa Ratna Shri, who is omniscient Lord of the Dharma, master of interdependence, continue and increase through study, practice, contemplation, and meditation until the end of samsara. Om Ah Hom. Om Ah Hom. May my body, speech, and mind become inseparable from the body, speech, and mind of all the enlightened ones.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Michael. Good to see you all. Rebecca, I hope your dog is okay.
See you soon.
Sure,
Lance.
he'll be fine.
All right. All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So we'll see you all next week. Thank you so much.